Hey guys, welcome to my studio. I am Abby Miller. I am an artist, independent clothing designer, and educator working out of Portland, Oregon. And today we're going to go over how to drape a basic sloper bodice front and back. A sloper is a basic foundation of a pattern that has no seam allowance built into it. So the great thing about a sloper as a foundation for a pattern is that you can easily build basic shapes off of it, like an A-line dress or a little shell or a t-shirt. But it's also just a great starting place to then build more complex designs off of if you want to do a combination between draping and flat pattern making. So essentially it's like a piece that you can start from and then kind of design around and off of, much like a key. So the things that I really like about draping and why I think it's exciting as a process, especially when you're starting out with clothing construction, is that you can really see your design take shape right in front of you. So it gives you a really good understanding of how fabric moves on the form. Also, when you're starting out, it really helps visualize what grain line is and how it falls on the body and how that affects the way your design fits and looks. It's also a really tactile process. So personally for me, I always really like to start with draping and then use a combination of flat pattern and draping to move on from. But draping is really exciting because it can kind of open your mind up to the possibilities of a new shape or how flow comes into a garment. And it's a much more sculptural process than taking a bunch of measurements and working in theory and working flat and then kind of keeping your fingers crossed and hoping that that then is going to translate to the form in the way you want it to. Draping gives you the ability to be a little bit more intuitive and kind of see how your ideas are working in real time. So that's a great thing. Another reason I really like it is because if you have a dress model that is a sizable one that adjusts up or down in terms of its width and size, or you have some pads and you can pad out your dress form, or you're working with a live model, it really gives you the chance to see how designs work on different body types. And I am of the proponent that I think strong design is garments that work on a variety of different body types. Not every shape or design is going to work well with every body type, which we all know from living in the world and having human bodies and shopping for clothing. But I think that, a real strength as a designer is to be able to make a garment that isn't just designed for a small subset of body types or people. And draping really gives you more control over how things might look on a different shape. So you will figure out what you like more. And draping, I think today you'll get a real understanding of how to move fabric around a form, how to create structure using a few guidelines, and it should give you some ability to then go back onto the dress form and be able to kind of create some new designs past the sloper. Okay. So before we head over to our dress forms, I just want to go over our little toolkit of things we need to drape. So first thing is a pencil. I personally really like Staedtler drawing pencils. This is, a 2B lithograph pencil. It doesn't have to be this, but I like pencils that are a little bit softer because they typically make a darker mark on your muslin without having to press really hard. They don't have to be incredibly sharp to get a good line. Just make sure whatever kind of pencil you're using, that it is a pencil and it's not a pen or a Sharpie. because you don't want your lines to bleed through onto your dress form. Dress forms are so expensive. They're really hard to clean. And the better care you take of them, you're just kind of keeping your investment in your equipment strong. And it's just, those lines can bleed onto fabric. And anyway, so use a pencil, whatever kind of pencil it is. You're going to want a measuring tape. You can use a flexible ruler as well. I just prefer a measuring tape, obviously, because it's not rigid, so it moves around the form, and you can get more accurate measurements with it. The other thing we're going to need is pins. I really like the wrist cushion for the pins because they're literally on hand. But you don't need this. I just got like a cheap $2 one. You can make your own, be creative. There's other things you can do too. For instance, when you're working on the front of the form, you can load up the back of the form with pins, which I like to do a lot of times. And then they're just right there on the dress form for you to grab. And likewise, if you're working on the back, you can load them up into the front. Sometimes you'll have a neck piece that's padded out and you can stick them in there. The basic thing is that you just want the pins to be totally out of the way of the area you're draping. A little note on pins. There's different kinds of pins. There's, the plastic ball. Those come in different sizes. Some of them are quilting pins. And then there's the, let's see if I can get this up there. There we go. The flathead stainless steel pins. I like a combination of both. I actually use these guys for my underpinnings with my twill tape and my design lines because they're totally flat and so they don't get in the way. And I like to use these on the top because you can actually see where you're pinning and it just gives you a little bit more control. But again, some of this is personal preference, so as you move along, you will figure out what works best for you. Also, you are going to need twill tape. We don't need very much to do the basic sloper, which is pretty nice. Twill tape is not expensive. It's a 1/4 inch. It comes in different sizes, 5/8, 1/4 inch, 1 inch. You just want to get a smaller size. And the reason why we use a twill tape is so that we can actually see it underneath the muslin. Most dress forms are going to have guidelines sewn into them, and I believe yours do. They've got the center front sewn in, they've got the princess seam sewn in, the side seam, the shoulder seam. You should have a center front marker. You should have the nape with a marker. And if not, we'll go over that. It's pretty easy to find. But we're going to use the twill tape to mark our bust line and the back apex. And that's just going to be a guideline for us. So we'll go over that in a minute. But and then there's, I think I left it over in the corner. There's also draping tape, which is different than twill tape. So twill tape you have to pin to your dress form. Draping tape is, it kind of comes in even thinner sizes than twill tape. It also comes in larger widths, but it's has a feel and kind of the same use as painting tape, but it allows you to kind of stick it onto the form. And the thing that's nice about draping tape is that you can get organic lines and curves a lot easier than with the twill tape, just because it's not as bulky, you don't have to pin as much. It's pretty good about being able to stick and restick several times. In the end, it's a little more expensive, and twill tape you can keep using again and again. So that'll be your preference. But for today, we're going to use the twill tape. And you probably really only need 1/2 yard to 3/4 yard max. Okay, and then we're going to need a ruler. I really like these quilting rulers because You don't have to get an L square. It gives you a square. It has all the measurements within it. But any kind of ruler will work. And then, of course, last but not least, our muslin. So before we start, let's make sure our muslin is all ironed and steamed out. So if you haven't done that yet, take a moment to iron your muslin, and then let's go meet at the dress form. All right, so here we are at our dress form. There's a few things we need to mark before we get started. Your dress forms should have the center front marked. Usually it's with a stitch line. You might also have some tape on yours, but usually it's with the seam line. You'll have your shoulder line marked and your side seam, which you can see here, and your waistline. So if your waistline isn't marked, we can start there with the twill tape. But if it is, don't worry about it. So when we're draping, typically, especially with a sloper, we're just going to work on one side of the body. There's a couple reasons why we do that. One is that it's a symmetrical design, so we want it to be exactly the same on the left side and the right side. And it doesn't matter if you drape on the left or the right. So as we move along, just pick a side that is most comfortable for you and drape on that. So when you're draping, you're draping on one side uses less fabric, but B, if you were to drape one side and you were to put in your darts and then move to the other side and do the same thing, you're creating twice as much work, and you're also leaving more room for human error. Because even after you've draped a ton of times, getting the exact same dart position on one side as the other is a lot harder to do by hand than it is to just take the half of the sloper, go back to your drafting table, and then draft it as a half and flip it over and copy that draft, which is what we'll be doing. So, yeah, that's just kind of there of course are designs that are asymmetrical, and as you get going, then, you might be working across the diagonal, or you might be draping in for a piece to kind of have positionality over here and something different happening on this side of the body. But for today, we're just doing the basic sloper, which is always going to be equal on both sides. So we'll start there. So if your waistline isn't marked, go ahead and take your twill tape. And what you want to do is you want to go all the way around the body, the form, and line up your twill tape so that it's the bottom of the twill tape hits the seam line. And then a note on pinning, which is really important. So the way that you pin actually does matter. So you want to pin so that the head of the pin, which is this guy, is actually working against the tension of the twill tape. So for instance, I'm going this way with my twill tape. I want the head of the pin to act as an anchor, so my pin is going to go this way as well. So I'm going to go ahead and put my pin in my twill tape, pin it to the form, and I'm going to go that way with it. So you can see when I pull on it, it doesn't come out. And then we're going to go around the form and go all the way around the back and meet on the other side. And then when you meet on the other side, go ahead and put your pin in the opposite direction that you put your original pin in, and that will hold the tension in. And what you can do is you can kind of go along and just make sure that your waistline matches up with the bottom of your tape the whole way around the form. You can kind of just slide it down like that, okay? So a quick note about the waistline too. Most dress forms are going to have them marked. If they don't, the waistline is the thinnest, the narrowest part of your dress form. On some dress forms, this is very obvious. On others, you might have to take some measurements. If you're working on a human body, typically, but not always, the natural waistline can fall around the belly button. But a good way to tell, because all bodies are so different, is that you can have your model do a bend. And usually the natural waistline is where the body bends naturally. That's typically the narrowest part. You might be working with a model that has very narrow, kind of straight up and down body. So that is a good kind of place to test. But for now, let's just follow the seam line on your dress form, and luckily for us, it's pretty easy to locate. All right, so the next thing we want to mark with our twill tape is the bust line. The bust line is going to start from your center front, and it's going to go over the widest part. Let's see if I can get my dress model turned. The widest part of the bust line. So where the bust line reaches its widest part is called the apex, and that typically is where like the nipple would fall. So that is an important marker, because this guideline here is what we're going to be draping our bust line dart into, but it's also going to be the guideline we have for our waist dart. So again, let's grab our twill tape, and we're going to start at the center front. So the thing about draping too is that you really have to trust your eye. So, your dress form might actually have the bust line sewn into it. Some of them do. But if it doesn't, just go ahead and eyeball it. There's a couple of important things about the bust line. One is that it falls over the widest part, and two is that it stays parallel to your waistline. So let's start at our center front with the widest part. And again, our pin's going in this way. So we pull on it and it's taut. And let me just show you really quick what I mean. So if you were to put the pin in this way, the opposite direction, you go to pull on it and it just comes out. So you'll learn pretty quick if you've done it the right way or not. But all right, so we're going to start here. I'm going to pin in our twill tape. Okay. And then we are just going to go over the widest part all the way around to the side seam. So I'm looking at this and I can tell it's hard to see on the camera because the body's curved. So on the video, it makes it look like it's going down. But actually, what I can tell from looking at it now is that it's going across the widest part and it's not going too far up or too far down. And so, okay, here's a good, you'll see the line kind of dip. If you go evenly across, it'll lie nice and flat. You might have to do it a couple of times to get it. We'll check it. And then we're going to go in again, opposite direction that we started with our pin, so this way. Okay, great. Now we're just going to come back and look at it and make sure it's even. So if your bust line is too far up or too far down, it's going to skew how you end up putting that dart in, because this is the guideline we use to place our grain across. So our grain is going to be intersecting this line, which we'll go over in a minute. But it is important that you keep this as parallel as you can. Now, you don't need to grab a level or anything like that. It's really important that you start to trust your eye and you start to feel out, like step back from it, take a look. You can do some measurements like this. Just kind of start to feel it out. Okay, so other important part that we need to mark right now is the actual apex. So that's going to be the highest point across the bust line. Again, yours might have your marking there. I actually like to use a pin that has one of the round heads on this. It just kind of gives me another feeling point for when I am actually draping. So I'm going to go ahead and mark the apex. So this is important because we're going to be taking some measurements from center front to the apex and then center front to the side seam in a minute. And that's going to give us our the guidelines that we're going to draw into the muslin. So we just want to make sure that we have this so we know our dart's going to be coming down this way and this way. Okay, so for this next part, you are going to need your measuring tape, your pencil, and a little pad of paper. So if you don't have that on hand, let's just take a minute and go grab those tools. Okay, so first measurement we want to take is the length of the form. So the length and the width are both going to have quite a few inches added onto them because when you drape, you actually end up taking the fabric in. So you're going to give yourself plenty of extra room to drape with. So this measurement from the nape of the neck to the bottom of the waistline and from the center front to the side seam, don't worry about those being ultra specific. Get them as close as you can. This measurement is what we're going to want to be as specific with as we can. All right, so the nape of the neck or the neckline, most dress forms have them marked either with a pin or a little divot. If not, you can kind of feel on the dress form. It's typically right where the neckline starts to curve in. So let me get so like right about here. And you're just going to come down. So go ahead and measure from the nape of the neck down the center front to the bottom of your twill tape. So for me, that's about 13¼ inches. And what you can do is you can mark it NL to WL, 13¼ Okay. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to take our center front across the side seam, and you're going to go across the bust line, so again like the widest part, and you're going to measure just right on the other side of your side seam. And so for me, that's 9½. So that's going to be marked SF for center front to SS, which is side seam, 9½ inches. So, okay, what I was going to say is that it is important where you mark to. So, measure to. So, for instance, if you're gonna mark above your waistline, you want to make sure that your twill tape is actually the top of it meets the seam. And since ours is at the bottom, we measure below. If you don't, you're going to end up shortening your pattern and you're not going to have enough when you go to drape. So this becomes really important when you start draping, a shell. So if you were to drape a skirt that came up to here and say you were draping it and you made your pattern and it ended at the top of your twill tape, but then you weren't consistent with that, and when you went to go drape the skirt bottom, you started it here. Okay, well then you have a 1/4 inch gap in your pattern that you didn't make up for because of the twill tape. So what I suggest is just always measuring below the twill tape, and same on the side seam, on the other side of the side seam. It's just kind of, whatever you do, just stay consistent doing it throughout. Okay, so next that we want to measure is we want to do the center front, and make sure you place your tape right. Let's see if I can get this in here, get my hand out of the way. You want to place your measuring tape right at your center front mark. That's important. Okay, so we're gonna measure the center front to the bust line, or excuse me, the across the bust line to the apex. And mine looks like 3¼ So SF center front to apex, 3¼ Okay. All right. So these should be all the measurements we need to do the front. We're going to turn the form around and do the back. But for now, go ahead and take those 3 measurements and go, let's go back to our drafting tables and go get our muslin ready. All right, so let's go ahead and prep our muslin, get some guidelines on there and get it cut to size. There's a few things I wanted to go over with you guys just about muslin and some basic fabric properties. So I'm gonna try and tilt my camera here. So the selvage is the part of the fabric that comes off the loom. So typically it has kind of a finishing detail. You can see most muslins, it's like a tighter woven spot. It's basically what keeps the fabric from fraying. So we are not going to use the selvage line as our center front. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that it's kind of a tighter weave. So the grain isn't really starting till post selvage. There we go. And we're not just gonna tear it and go from the tear, because then we've got fraying and actually our grain line kind of goes out of whack too. So the main thing when we start to drape is that we want to know our grain line and we want to keep the fabric on grain so that when we go to place our darts, they're falling on grain, it's falling on the body correctly, and we just know we have a solid pattern. So a couple things. Grain is the line that actually follows the selvage. So when you're on a loom, there's your warp and your weft. Your warp is the vertical, your weft is the horizontal. If you grab a piece of fabric and say the selvage is torn off, it can be really ambiguous to figure out, like, okay, where's the lengthwise grain? Where's the crosswise grain? How do I know? So one trick that usually helps is if you pull across the lengthwise grain, it's going to have less stretch than across the crosswise grain. It's not a ton, and especially in muslin, because muslin's kind of light fabric, and obviously if you're using a stretch fabric, that's a totally different scenario. But so there's one way you can feel more stretch going across the cross grain. And then obviously the bias, which true bias is 45 degrees, cuts literally diagonally across the fabric. That is going to have the most stretch and movement of anything. So any garment that you see that is like fluid material and looks like it's hugging the body or moving on the body, that's almost always going to be cut on the bias. And the reason for that is because it has more flexibility. So if you think about a grid or any structure, where the parts meet, they're going to shift when they're turned as opposed to being on the grid. So that's kind of one way to visualize it. All right, so you've got your measurements here. So from your neckline to your waistline, go ahead and add 5 inches. And from your center front to your side seam measurement, add 5 inches to that too. Now, it might sound like a lot, but when you drape, you want to leave yourself excess room, because you're not just going to go up to the line where you're draping, you're going to go over it. So you want the piece to fall up to the neck and over, and then we cut the shape in. And same with, you have to think about, you're getting the whole contour of the body and you're creating more contour. So you want extra width. So I always go bigger. I think bigger is better. Once you start draping more and you get a feel, you can kind of tighten and maybe add 4 inches or 3 inches. But really, to begin, more is better, especially with muslin and a basic sloper, because you're going to want to be able to manipulate it. If you're going to be cutting into it, there's a lot of things we do with that excess fabric. So go ahead and get those measurements, and then let's get them measured out on our fabric. Okay, so now that you have your measurements for your total width and height, mine is 17 1/4 by 13 1/2 inches. Go ahead and measure your fabric across your length and your width. Okay, so I'm just going to do mine at 13 1/2, and I want 17 1/4. I'm just going to go ahead and bump that up to 17 1/2 for ease. And then one thing I can tell right away when I get my square on here is that you can see right through here. So my fabric isn't straight, and that's very typical because it's not on grain yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to cut our fabric, and then we're going to block it. And any little piece that's extra, we're just going to trim up. So go ahead and get your measurements and rip your fabric. The thing about muslin is that it tears very, very easily, which is really important. You're actually going to get a more accurate line by tearing it than cutting it. So make a little snip at your measurement and just go ahead and tear. Okay, and then I'm going to get the cross grain off the selvage, make a snip here, and tear. All right. So now I've got my draping piece. And what we want to do is we want to block it. So blocking your fabric just ensures that it's going to be square. So you just pull it on the diagonals, and then the cross grain and the lengthwise grain. And you don't have to go press it again. It's really nice if you have a gridded mat, which you guys may or may not have. Let me see if I can get my camera. There we go. So I can actually see, I can line this up. And actually, now that this is torn, this is pretty square. So I don't think I have to go through and cut up any edges. I know one thing I can do if I really, really want to get into the nitty of my grain line, I can pull a thread. So you just take one tiny little thread right towards the selvage, and you just start pulling on it. And it's very tedious, and you don't need to do it when you're just draping with muslin. But if you are looking for your grain line in like a final fabric, or you're draping with like a nicer fabric and the grain line's really important, so see how I've got this thread and I'm just pulling on it. So what you would do is you'd pull that all the way through, and then you can see this little space right here where I pulled the thread out. That's your grain line. And that's what you would line up and make your flat kind of parallel line to drape everything off of. So knowing how to find your grain is always really important, and it's like a first baseline for any pattern making. But more specifically, it's really, really important when you go to construct your piece in your final fabric. So don't worry about pulling the thread today, but let's make sure your piece you're starting with is square, and then we'll start marking some guidelines. Again, let me just show you really quickly down here. If you are working on the left side of your body, your center front will be on the right side. If you're draping on the right side of the body, your center front will be on the left side and you'll be working over. So you have to think center front, side seam. So just keep that in mind. Your selvage line is going to be your center front. We just want to make sure you're marking this correctly so you don't have the wrong marks. And then you go to put it to your form and you have to drape on the other side. which wouldn't be the end of the world. It would just mean you would have to move your twill tape as opposed to redraw your lines. All right, so you've got your fabric cut, and now we're going to draw some guidelines into it. The guidelines are there basically to help ensure that you're staying on grain while you're draping, and they're really important. So we're going to start by getting our center front marked. So we want to do an inch in from the selvage, and hot tip here, most yardsticks and even just standard rulers are about 1/4 of an inch wide. You have enough added fabric across here. Rather than going and just marking an inch all the way down, which is super tedious, I just use the width of my ruler. So line up your ruler very precisely with the edge of your selvage. Make sure that it hits that edge. Put pressure on your ruler and go ahead and mark a line from top to bottom all the way down. This is going to be your center front that you're working off of. And if you want, you can just mark CF so you know. But it's going to be pretty obvious. Where is it? There it is. What it is. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come and we're just going to fold all along this line we drew. The really nice thing about muslin is that it creases, hand creases really well. And it's actually a preference to hand crease in your lines as opposed to ironing it. Because when you iron it, it actually can kind of resist the blocking that you did, kind of shrinks it up. And so it's kind of counterintuitive to think like, oh, why wouldn't ironing be good for this? And it's not the end of the world. Like if you're having trouble getting that crease in the way you want, and you just want to make sure that you're sticking on your line so that it's nice and straight. So now I've got my fabric pressed towards the back side. This is now my front side. This is our center front that we will be draping off of. And again, we're just doing that so we can get our selvage out of the way and get working with a grain line that is free and clear of the selvage. Okay, so next thing we want to do is go ahead and fold your fabric in half, making sure you line up your edges very cleanly, and then hand press a crease in at the fold. And I just kind of like to bring resistance down from the top and across. You'll get the hang of it. Just making sure everything stays lined up while we're doing it. And then you can pull this off and you can see, even after I lift it up, see how clean and crisp and clear that is? So now that is going to be our bust line. So go ahead and grab your ruler. Now this is the part that is a little tricky, but not terribly so. So you want to make sure this is staying really square. So what I'm doing is I'm getting my, hopefully you have a T-square. If you just have a ruler, that's fine too. You just want to make sure your edge is really straight along the side of your fabric so that it's as lined up as possible, because we want this line to literally intersect the grain of the fabric at a 90-degree angle. And that's really important because we want every line that comes off of this to follow the grain. So you don't want your line to be down or up, you want it to come straight across. So go ahead and line up your ruler. And if you have a mat with a grid underneath and you can see it, you can also use that as your guideline. Or one of these clear guys. Line it up. And then draw your line all the way across. Okay, and then we can mark it bust line if you need to remember. Can you guys see? My lighting is kind of... Okay, there we go. So we've got our bust line. Okay. So now, from our bust line, we want to mark our center front to apex and our center front to side seam. So my center front to apex was 9.5 inches. So I'm going to come in from the center front and mark, oops, excuse me. My center front to apex was, that makes way more sense, 3.25. So 3.25, I'm going to mark with a little X right on the line. And if you want, you can mark an A on it. And then my center front to side seam, that was 9.5. So then I'm going to mark that and do side seam. So from the apex down, again, if you have one of your rulers, we'll mark 3.25 inches all the way down. So mine, this is super handy because on this clear ruler, I can make sure that my line is just equal all the way down. There we go. And I'm going to draw a line vertical from the apex down. Okay. So that's going to be, it's going to end up being about the middle of our dart line. Okay. And let's go ahead and draw a line down from the side seam as well. So again, I'm going to square it off at the top and at the bottom of my fabric. So this is intersecting the crosswise grain and following the grain of the fabric. Okay, got my side seam and my apex on there. Now we're going to split the difference. So you're going to take your side seam mark and just kind of fold gently, you don't have to crease it, but fold gently along that line and bring it to the apex. And what's left over, this middle part, you want to crease that. This is just going to be another guideline for when we go to drape. Okay, so you can see the crease in the middle. So I've got bust line, apex down, I've got the side seam and down, and then I'm going to have basically what is sort of equivalent to the princess seam in the middle, and I'm going to draw a line down that. Again, making sure all of these lines are square and parallel to the grain of the fabric. So go ahead and get that marked up. Okay. All right. So these are the marks we need to start draping. So if you haven't got them all, go ahead and get them done, and then bring your piece of fabric over to your dress form. Okay, so here we are at our dress forms. We have got our marked muslin. Go ahead and take your center front fold line and get your apex and bust line together. So I think you can kind of see that here's the nice thing about the twill tape being dark is that you can see that the bust line needs to just follow that line all the way across. So what I like to do is I like to actually kind of place it right along the top and just kind of maintain that. It can also go, a little bit in the center, but just basically you want this to stay straight with your twill tape. So let's go ahead and we're going to, another note before we pin is that we're going to build a little bit of ease into our fabric as we drape. So ease is in most patterns, it's usually around 1/8, and it's not very much. But what the ease does is that it provides just a little bit of room, so there's extra movement and stretch. It's really important when you're working with cotton or non-stretch materials that are fitted like this, because it's going to leave some more room in the bust so that we don't have this piece that's incredibly tight against the body once it's constructed. So what I like to do is just a little tiny, you can just barely see just a little divot. See if I can turn it to the side. You can kind of see how it's just the smallest amount. And then go ahead and take your pins and pin below and above that little divot. Okay. And then let's go ahead and keep this all the way at the center front of our fabric back and pin it at the top. And I like to pin both up and down on the center front just to give you some more stability. Tension in both ways. If you get it puckering a little bit, just kind of smooth it out. Okay, you're just gonna let the bottom part hang for right now, so don't worry about that. And then let's go ahead and let's get our bust line pinned in. So I like to pin it at the apex. Just like that. And then over just on the opposite side of the side seam. So you can kind of feel where your side seam is. Just pin right on the very edge of that. And you should have your side seam mark to help you out there. Okay, so now we've got our bust line pinned, our center front pinned, and you can see we've got excess fabric through here and here. And so this is what we're going to be moving around to manipulate into our drape. First thing we're going to do is we're going to start at the neckline and go this way. So it doesn't really matter. You can go this way or this way, but you kind of want to move across the dress form in a consistent manner. What that does is that you're going to be clipping into your fabric to ease the tension. So you want to adjust this part after you've done this part. You can kind of think about it like if you've ever stretched a canvas and you go in sections so that you get even stretching. This is kind of the same way. You don't want to work on both parts at the same time because you want to get all the tension out in one area and then come back in and smooth it out in another, because it actually does, it does get affected. The top will affect the bottom and vice versa. Okay, so first thing we want to do is we want to get some of this tension out around the neckline so we can get this to lie flat. There's a couple different ways you can drape a sloper block. One, you can do a shoulder dart or you can do a bust dart. There's no right or wrong way, they're just different styles. I personally like the bust dart. It's a little bit more contemporary and I think just a little bit more versatile for designing off of this, because again, keep in mind, like we're not draping this to come up with a new shape or surprise ourselves. We are draping a block that can be a pattern that we go take and make a flat pattern out of and then work from. So very different styles. But first thing we're going to do is we're going to just clip. So you want to go above the neckline. You don't want to go into the nape. When you're slicing through here, you don't want to cut into the seam line or go below the neckline. If you do, we can make up for it when we go to transfer, but it just can create some inconsistencies. So go ahead and start about a half an inch above where you pinned and just cut out just a little square. So it starts to move around the neck. And you can kind of see already how, okay, that's already released some of the tension and gapping through here. So now we're gonna come in and we're gonna just do a little slice right in here to release some of that tension. And I just like to go conservatively to start, again, because we don't wanna clip into our neckline or our shoulder line, okay? Now we're gonna come around and we're gonna do the same things at the top. Okay, so you can see already, because I've released that tension around the neckline, which is where we will be slicing and marking it to have our finished product, it's already lying flat. So you can see all of this is smoothed out just because I notched through here. Let me get you guys in kind of close. Okay, so you can see my notching. I'm actually gonna go in a little bit further. So my shoulder line is right here, and my notch is just like right up to it. So this one looks good. I don't wanna take that any deeper. If I go deeper on that, then I run the risk of clipping into my fabric. So I'm gonna go ahead and clip that, but I'm just gonna come in another spot there. So if you think about a curved seam or a curved line, you know, where the line curves at the sharpest inner part, there will be the most tension actually on the outside. So if you clip that, it releases it all the way around. So when you go to do garment construction, it's why you clip a seam around the arm side or any area where you need extra movement, because you're releasing that tension. So essentially you're doing the same thing here. You're releasing the tension. Okay, so now let's go ahead. Let's just pin. Just keep it smooth and pin all along your neckline. All the way up to the shoulder seam. We usually use like 3 to 4 pins. Okay, so now we've got this nice and flat all the way around, and you can see how we're gonna start to move our fabric down into our bust line, but we've gotta release some tension through the arm too. So now we're gonna come in through the back side, and we're gonna do the same kind of style of notch, but you have to keep in mind, so here is my shoulder seam right here. Your guys' should have a seam line, or it should be marked. A lot of times there's a metal bracket in there. You do not want to cut past the edge of the metal bracket. In fact, you want to try to leave 1/4 of an inch to an inch away from that. So again, start conservatively. Just go ahead and release some of that tension. Okay. And we'll come up here. You can see like it's kind of gapping a bit through right here. So we're going to just release it up through here. Okay. And that helps us fall kind of evenly around, and it's just going to help us manipulate this a bit more too. All right, so a note about the shoulder area. Why don't we go ahead and we're going to put a pin just at the very top along our seam line up to the shoulder plate. And then I like to kind of smooth it out and just put a pin in right there just to kind of keep it stabilized. Don't worry about this being super flat. We have this excess fabric, which is going to get folded into our bust dart. But also the thing to keep in mind is that you don't want to make your bust dart so tight. You don't want to pull all this fabric in that your shoulder seam, your arm seam is like right up to the body. You want to give it a little bit of room, a little bit of ease, because bodies move. And so again, like we need to build in some easement into our pattern. So what I like to do is, you can see there's just like a little bit of fabric right there. I just am going to go ahead and pin back my excess for now. You can pin it behind. I don't have a metal plate, so I'm just going to actually pin it right there. Okay, and that's good for now. Okay, we're going to come back to the bust dart, but we're going to move into our waist dart. So we've got these grain line guidelines here. We have the apex and what's equivalent to the princess seam and the side seam. What we want to do is continue pinning all the way down the front. So get your center seam, center front all matched up on your form to right below the waistline. Because remember, I like to go below the twill tape. If you have decided you're going above the twill tape on everything, then be consistent with that and know that when you go to measure, if you were doing your full hip line and everything, your bottom part would come above the twill tape. Okay, so here's why I love these guidelines, because again, we've got this that we're going to manipulate into a dart, but you can see, like, if I start making my dart, because I have all this tension here, it's going to start pulling away from my center front. And we don't want that. We want the center front to lay as flat as possible. So we're going to come into these guidelines. We're going to clip them just to like a 1/4 inch below our waistline, our twill tape. So just go ahead and that ends up being about 2 inches, 1.5 inches. Start conservatively and go along your apex line and your princess line and your side seam. Okay, so you can see I've got kind of like a fringe going. And now when I go to fold this in, and I'm even gonna clip it up through here a little bit because I see it pulling. So now when I go to fold, it's just way less tension through the front of here. So it's starting to fall flatter already, which is good because we don't want any puckering through here. We want the fit to be clean. Okay, so let's talk about where our darts fall into the form and why. So the one thing, kind of rule of thumb with darts, is that you never want your darts to actually go into the apex. Granted, you might make a decision to have a design line and do something that's kind of, more pointed or cone-like, but the more your darts come up into here, the more you're getting like a 90-degree square edge. So the lower your dart, the more space you have here for this fabric to kind of be smoothed out and around. So typically, if it's a bigger bust, the dart is going to end lower here and on the side because you're creating more space for the breast. Another note too, so my dress form, I believe, has, I think like a higher difference between my bust line and waistline. It's a little bit more extreme of a measurement. So my dart is actually going to be wider at the bottom than yours. So all bodies are different, obviously. And you might be draping for a form where it's a small bust and a very, similar waistline. So your dart could be anywhere from, 1/4 inch, a very, very, very small dart, to less. Sometimes certain body types don't even need a bust dart. That being said, darts aren't just for fit. They can be design lines too. So no matter like what the bust to waist ratio is, you can almost always build in a dart and give that kind of tailored look. But rule of thumb is that the waist dart should end anywhere from 1 inch to 3/4 inch below the apex, and same for the bust dart. So you're leaving an area there that's not, coming directly up into what essentially is the nipple, unless that's your intention. And then you can go contact Jean-Paul Gaultier and go be couturier for him. So, all right. Let's go ahead, and what we're gonna do is we're just gonna place a pin where our princess line is. So go ahead and move your fabric so that this is nice and flat, and your excess, this part, is headed towards your center front. So you're gonna come in through the side. Don't worry about your side seam lining up with your side seam on your dress form. This is just a guideline. It's not gonna be where our final side seam ends. You can even like run your hand along your side seam and you'll see, oh, it's not totally spot on with this. That's because the body curves. And if you were going to have a garment, say, where you wanted it to fall really straight, like an A-line garment, then yes, you would not form this in. You would just have it fall straight. You might even manipulate this line out so it would get angled this way. But for now, just go ahead and let that hang, and go ahead and smooth out your princess seam and put a pin right below your waistline on your twill tape. Okay, so here is where our apex guideline becomes really important. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna go along your guideline starting about 1 inch to 3/4 of an inch below your apex, and you're just going to give it a crease right along that line and keep the line in the middle as much as possible. I like to just use my fingernails. If you don't have long fingernails, that's totally okay. Your fingers will do a good job. And you can see, like, as you get closer to the bust, there's less to pinch there, right? And more towards the bottom. Okay, so what we're gonna do, this is gonna become the center of our dart, the apex line. So you can see we've got our pin in here. We've got just a really nice, clean, smooth line coming from the bust line down to the waistline. And we've got this, you can see the dart already, see it? We've got this kind of triangle flap of fabric here. That's our dart, and we've got the middle of the dart. So rule of thumb with the dart is that it needs to be even on each side of the dart all the way up to the middle. So just think of basic geometry. You don't want like 1 inch on this side and 3/4 inch on this side. You want the same. So what you're gonna do is just kind of bring your fingers down. This does not need to be right up against the body. We're not looking to have a dart that comes in and contours the body. We're looking to have a dart that gives the shape and kind of keeping it like a box. So there's different kinds of darts. There's French darts that have a little bit more of a curve. That's not what we're doing for a basic sloper. A basic sloper, we're just gonna do your classic straight edge dart. Now, if you were working with a fabric that had more stretch, or you were working in different areas to get in and out of the garment, and you wanted that super sleek contour, you would go ahead and pattern that in later or drape it in later. But for today, just go ahead and start at the bottom here. And we're gonna put a pin below the waistline, just right on either side of that fabric we've nipped. So your pins should be very close together. There's my flap. There's 1 pin, 2 pin. So they're like almost right next to each other, okay? And they're both below the twill tape. All right. Okay, so now we want to go ahead and we want to start marking where our dart is. This is really important because if you don't, you're going to get back to your table and go, oops, I draped it, but I have no idea where my dart is. So right below your pin, mark each spot, and then go ahead and take a pin. What I like to do is I just like to go, so I've got about an inch below my apex, and I put a pin there, and I'm gonna mark it. And then we want to try to get a straight line from the top of our dart to the bottom. And again, you can kind of see. So we're just going to mark it like 3 times on the way up, 3 or 4 times, right to where your top pin is. And you're going to do the same on the other side. We will, when we transfer this, we're going to do what's called truing. So get this as close as you can, but don't worry about it being perfectly straight or perfectly even on either side. That's why we have our apex line, because we will true each side to the apex line. And typically what I do is I take whichever measurement is closer to the apex line, smaller. And the reason why I like to do that is because sometimes when you go to mark, you do end up getting too close to the body, or you can come into the fabric a little too far, and then you've made your pattern really tight. And again, we're not building enough ease into it. So then what I like to do is you can take out this top pin and just go ahead and smooth it over to the center front and just pin it right below the waistline again. Okay? So now we have our waistline dart. Okay, so I've got my dart folded and pinned over. One thing I like to do from here is I just like to go ahead and pin it this way again, just right in the middle of the dart, or even just straight into the form, just to keep that nice and taut. So as we're working through, we're not pulling this. You can even do it in a couple spots, but you just want it to be really even right on that line. You can see all the way through my dart, I've got my line right here in the fold. So that's one way to tell that you're keeping your dart on line. Okay, next thing we're gonna do is we're just gonna move along here, and we're going to match up our side seam line, just again, right on the outside of our side seam. It should fall right there. If it's a little bit over, don't worry about it. If you see like some gapping here, you can go ahead and cut this again right up to the twill. See how that just immediately releases that little pucker right there? So again, it's important for you to cut up into your fabric, because it also lets you know that you're releasing any puckering here, and it's due to the tension at the bottom and excess of your fabric, and has nothing to do with the success of your draping. So, you know, you gotta trust yourself along the bottom part. It depends on how much fabric you have left over. It depends on the weight of the muslin. So you can even just come in and start, you know, giving it some extra trims. You can come up a little bit higher, and you'll just start to see it release more and more. You don't want to go, you want to keep it so that when you press it flat, and it has to be flat to the body, that it's still below your twill tape. Like you can see here, I got real close to my twill tape with this one right here. It's like right up there, and I don't want to go any further than that. Okay, so we've got like a really nice clean line through here. So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna come in and we're just going to pin all along the waistline below the twill tape, just to ensure that our fabric isn't gonna move anymore. It's not gonna shift on us. We've done a really good job with our waist dart. And we just wanna ensure that all that work we've done is now gonna pop up into the bust dart. Okay, so what I like to do is just kind of shift around. And at this point, you can just go ahead and cut off a little square if you have some extra excess there. You can even come in here, trim this up,
Just give you a better idea of what's going on. Start to see the shape a little bit more. Okay. Alrighty, now we're gonna move into the bust start. Alrighty, so we've got our waistline pinned all the way to the side seam, and we're still pinned up along our shoulder seam and at the bust line. So now you're going to release that bust line pin, and you'll see, okay, I've got this fabric here that's gonna move into the bust dart, but okay, we don't want our dart to fall sloping. We wanna keep it pretty even with our tape. So we're still gonna use our bust line as our center of our dart. So go ahead and do what we did on the other one and just crease along that center line. Okay. And then we're actually going to move up with it. It's gonna get harder the closer you get in because you're not gonna have a lot of fabric to work with. And again, don't pull it so tight that this is strained. You want to leave a little bit of ease. So like my dart is going to end right about here. So if you get to a point where you're going to make the crease and like there's barely any fabric to hold on to, you've gone too far. So leave enough that there's like little less, about 1/8 of an inch fabric through here, between the apex and where your dart's gonna end. So I'm just going to crease along that line. And it's definitely a skill. There's other ways you can kind of just smooth it up too with your hand. But you can see, we're gonna move this down. Just trying to keep that line. And you can see, okay, how my apex line, because we wanted to stay falling across the grain. So see how my dart, the top of my dart, this will become the seam line, is still falling straight across my apex. So, and I've got a little bit of wiggle room in through here. It's not too tight. So now I'm gonna go ahead and pin right beyond the side seam. Okay, and then I'm just going to crease and still try to work it so that that line that I drew, the bust line, is the dart fold. Okay? And I'm gonna end it right about here. So I'm gonna put a pin in there as well. Now, don't worry, you're gonna see like a little bit of a gap through here. Don't worry. When we go to measure it, again, we're gonna true it up so that this and becomes our end spot, and everything that comes off of it comes out at an angle. So this little gap that you see here, it's gonna 100% release and just become part of the bust ease, and it will release up into here too. So it's really not a problem if you have just a little bit. It's not gonna wind up being quite as flat as through here. All right, so then let's go ahead and mark right at our pin, the top. And I just like to do a line that kind of goes, whoop. You wanna make sure that it goes above and below. And make sure you do the same on here too. Go back and check your mark. Okay, did I mark the top of my dart enough so that I can see it, so that I know? Okay, and then you can even mark along the top of here. And we can go ahead and put our pin back below the dart and mark through here. Okay, and that's gonna give us an idea. We can come back and do that here too if we want. We marked our lines, but if you want, you can mark where the dart folds over, just to give you a visual. Okay, so we have got our basic bodice front draped. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna go in And we're going to start making some marks so that we know how our shoulder seam is going to go. So start up at the very edge of your shoulder plate, right along your shoulder seam, and mark it. I just like to do a little X. And then you're going to come all along your shoulder plate and just do little X's, okay, down to where the shoulder plate meets the side seam. So you can see I've got my lines, my little marks coming from top of the shoulder seam down into the side seam. Don't worry about it being exactly the right curve. Again, we're going to true that up when we measure it. We're not going to cut straight to here, but we do want to make sure that we've got that curve generally where we like it. And it should come above the bust dart. So the bust dart should start anywhere from about 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 an inch. Again, it kind of depends on the body, but if this is our seam line, right? So you can see that's our seam line right there. This is where my shoulder plate ends. It's about 1 inch down, okay? So it's not, if you're looking at it and you're like, yeah, but here's where my shoulder plate ends and here's where my dart starts. That's just your excess dart, okay? That's not the actual seam line. The actual seam line is here. So you'd be looking at from here to the bottom of your dart, that's about 1 inch. Okay, and then let's go ahead and let's mark the shoulder seam. Just go ahead and feel across the top, and I like to do little slashes all the way to where the shoulder plate meets. Okay, and we're gonna do the same for the neckline. And we're gonna be conservative with the neckline, so go ahead and take your pins out. And you can take out this stabilizing pin now too. So we're gonna wanna come around and just get a nice line in there to the shoulder seam. If you have sliced into it too far, that's okay. Don't avoid your slice and go like, ooh, I'm gonna mark way below it. Mark actually through the slice, and then when you go to transfer, you're gonna have to basically piece your slice together and know that that's part of the neckline. So if you did slice, like you can see on mine, I came real close right there. If I would have cut into it even further, I would have still marked it across the slice line. So when I go to transfer, I know that my neckline isn't gaping. And again, don't worry so much about the angle and curvature of the neckline. We're going to have specific rulers that we're going to use to true that up. So you just want to leave enough fabric and get your marks close enough, and then we'll true that up. Okay, and then we're going to come over to the side seam, and we're going to feel right along, just along the outside of it. So you can see the side seam that I drew in is pretty close, but it's not quite there. So just go ahead and do some marks right along my side seam. And it does meet up right at my dart. So you can see mine is in just a little bit, and that's because the body curves. So again, if this was a very straight form with not much of a nipped waist, you might have this straight line here, and it might completely follow your side seam. So again, things you're paying attention to when you drape. It's never going to be the same for any dress form or any fabric. So there's a few things you got to look for. One, we know this is a really successful drape. We have no puckering through here. We have a little bit right here, but that's because we're leaving some ease in through our shoulder and arm seam. We are flat through here. We're flat through here. If I take my pins out, this gives us a better idea because the actual seam, again, the seam of my dart is here, okay? It's through the middle. So if I do like a faux seam with my pins, you can see I don't have any puckering through here. It's nice and flat, and same through here. So we've got a really successfully draped form. And now what we can do is clip off some of our excess fabric. Oh, I almost forgot. This is totally essential. We gotta mark the bottom of our waistline too. So just go ahead and mark all along the twill tape. You can take out some of your pins or just mark between them. Yeah, don't forget that. That's a big bummer if you do. Okay. That's where you want to have your mark because you don't want to cut it all along the bottom because again, we're going to be truing this up too. So the whole thing about marking right now is that we're going to come back in with a ruler once we cut all this and take it off the form and true everything up. And we're going to do that alongside the back. So next we're going to drape the back. And the back goes really quick. It's pretty straightforward and easy. But we're going to true both the patterns to each other because we want to make sure that our waistlines are the same, our side seams meet up, our shoulder seams meet up. So that is all done together at the very end. So right now, just go ahead and clip. You know, you can leave half an inch. It's kind of personal preference. You're going to clip along the side. Get that excess off and go ahead and just clip up through your shoulder. Take out my pin. The fun thing about this is that, it's once you get it off the form and you go lay it flat, it's going to give you a really good idea of like, oh, okay, totally see how that is just like a basic sloper pattern you've been working with. But now you did it 100% adjusted to this form. And it's a really powerful thing to know how to do. It might seem basic. It might seem like, oh, well, how is this any different than the block I was working with? Well, it's totally different because now you can go work on any form and know how to drape it. It's the same steps. It's the same tools for any size body. It's just getting the hang of paying attention to how the fabric falls, knowing, some of the markings to do and the measurements to do. And I know for me, I really like flat pattern and draping together. I think it's really fun and exciting to kind of work back and forth between both processes. But a lot of times I will start with a flat pattern, like a shape, and I'll go over this in a minute, but towards the end of our workshop, I'll go over it. And then I will start to apply that shape to the body and see how it drapes, and then I can start to build in lines and form, and I just have a really good sense of how that works on the body. And so the more you work back and forth, it just gives you more control as a designer. Okay, so let's go ahead and we've got our pattern, and we're going to take it back and we are going to start on the back. Okay, an important note too, before you go to drape your back, make sure you're working on the same side of the body you are working on the front. So don't drape on the right when you're on the front of the body and then drape on the right when you're on the back of the body. Flip it around and make sure that your apex line is on the same side of the body as the back apex line. So, you want to think about the fact that you're making the pattern that's going over one whole half of the body. If you drape on the right side of the body when you're doing your center front and you drape on the right side of the body when you're on your center back, because they're not mirror images, you're going to have to flip your pattern over and trace it again. So if you are on the right side on the center front, you want to be on the left side on the center back. And if you are on the left side on the center front, you want to be on the right side on the center back. So just trace your line over the body, keep it cut in half, but reverse it. I hope that made sense. Okay, so we've draped the front and now we want to drape the back. A few things to note is that you might think, oh, can I just use the same measurements for my length and width as the front? No, actually. And, again, different bodies are different, but sometimes people have really rounded backs or very flat and concave. So, again, we can't just use the same rectangular shape. We're going to take the same measurements, but it's a lot less. We are also going to find the apex of the shoulder. That's going to be the line that we build our shoulder dart off of. And there's a couple different things you can do with back darts too. You can do a waist dart or a shoulder dart. And actually, you can do both. But I think for today, we'll flatten out the shoulder dart and we'll just do a waist dart. So we're just going to go ahead and build our dart into one. If you wanted to do both, you would work in a similar way we did the back, where you would pin down the center front, and then you would pin across your apex, but you would split the difference between each set of fabric. The reason why I'm only doing a waist dart, again, I think shoulder darts, while they're really nice in some tailored garments, I don't put them into my sloper blocks very often because I don't design many garments that have this back shoulder dart in them. And so it just means that if my sloper, my permanent, pattern my pattern block that I'm building off of has that into, then I have to flush it out every time I design. So it just leaves me an extra step. So that's up to you. Certainly, if you're interested in having your dart here, I'm happy to answer some questions, and I'm sure Annika can show you how to split the difference in draping your dart. It's very similar to what we did in the front. So just take those skills and move them to the back. So the apex of the shoulder is going to be the widest part across the back. So if you feel on your form, there's going to be one part that kind of comes out more than the other. And we can't just look at it and go, okay, well, it's the widest part of the shoulder. It might be, but typically it's actually a little bit lower because you've got a little bit more of a rounded area here. So if you're, really wanting to know, you can grab your measuring tape. Okay, so, and we're going up to the shoulder plate. So, yeah, this one looks like it's right about here. So it's going to be right about the middle of your shoulder plate. Again, it doesn't have to be 100% exact. We're using this as a guideline. So let's go ahead and pin in our apex, and we're going to go again. We're resisting against, and we're making sure that line is consistent with our waistline and that it's parallel. Okay, and then we're going back this way to offer our resistance. Okay, and I'm just going to clip my excess because it's actually falling into my design area. Okay, so go ahead and grab your pencil and paper. All right, so we're going to take measurements again. We're going to do CB center back to WL waistline, and then we're going to do center back to side seam, SS, CB to SS. Okay, so again, we're going to go from the nape of the neck, and we're going to add inches to this again, just like we did to the front. So if you thought, oh, I have to come back around here, you could say, oh, like there's my 5 inches. See, we added 5 inches. There it is. It's because we've got to wrap around our shoulder. But for now, we're just going to go the nape to right below. And I am at 13 3/4 on the back. CB to WL, 13 3/4. And then from center back, and we're going to go, even though the apex of our shoulder does not fall into our side seam, we're just going to go ahead and measure that to, okay, so I've got from center back to my shoulder line is, I'm going to go just a bit over, a bit into the arm plate, and that's 8 inches. And the reason why we're not taking the true side seam here is because we want to get the widest part of the body. So if we were to just take our line to here instead of up along the widest part of the shoulder, we would probably add in enough inches to cover it, but why do that to yourself and then maybe not have enough fabric? So, okay, that's where we're going to start with the back. Let's go over, we're going to have our muslin prepped and ready to go, and once again, we're going to block and cut some rectangles to start draping.
Right, so we're going to go ahead and prepare our back muslin block in the almost exact same fashion we did the original one. So I'm not going to go over that piece by piece, but I'll just do a little reminder. But okay, so for your center back to your waistline, we're going to go ahead and add, we want 5 inches at the top and 5 at the bottom. So let's just go ahead and add 10 inches to it, which is that's giving you a lot. You probably don't need 5 inches below the waistline. Definitely, I like to do it above, and sometimes you might even need a bit more, but 10 inches is just a good, it's a good baseline. So for me, that means my center back to waistline is 23 inches and 3/4. Now, for the center back to the side seam on your width of your block, remember that we took the widest part of the body. So let's just go ahead and add 3 inches instead of 5, because we're already working past the side seam. So we're already gonna have a couple more inches towards the side seam, and we don't need a ton of excess to come around our shoulder plate, because we're not working into the shoulder plate and we're not dealing with a shoulder dart, we're just dealing with a waist dart. So we're gonna go center back to side seam plus 3 inches, which makes mine 11 inches. So go ahead and find your selvage and grain line on your muslin. Let's make sure it's pressed again. And then you're gonna do the same thing where you mark 1 inch from your center back, and you're gonna crease along that. And then you're gonna make sure that from that line, your whole piece, your dimension of your block, is the measurements we just took. So mine will be 23 3/4 inches long by 11 inches wide from my 1 inch mark, which will be, for me, that'll be here. So this way, and remember, again, which side you're draping on. So I'm draping to the right, so I actually want my center back to be on the left. So again, don't make that mistake. Go ahead and cut your fabric, block it, straighten it out, and then let's meet back with our, get them measured, and then we're gonna build in our apex line. So measure and cut, and then we'll build in our apex line. Okay, so now that you have your blocked and squared piece, we wanna mark the apex line of the back, so we can drape off of that and make sure our grain line is square. So remember how when we were measuring, I said, okay, about 5 inches can go from the apex up over the shoulder line. We're just gonna, because it's kind of random, but we're gonna add 2 inches to that, and we're gonna mark 7 inches down from the top
center back of our piece, and that's where our apex line is going to start. So we're just leaving ourselves plenty of fabric at the top to drape up and over the shoulder so we can get that line in. And it's just, we just want to make sure that those apex lines meet up and that our apex line is square so that we know that the grain of our sloper again is set. So, okay, I've got my piece here. Pull it down a little so you guys can see. And again, I've got my square ruler, which I just love. And I'm going to mark 7 inches down from the top. Mark it here. Make sure it's totally square at the top. Mark it here. And then I'm going to come in. And if you've got your gridded square, that's great. Or you can just use the edge of your ruler. And we're going to draw our line. Okay. And you can just mark it with an A. So now, this is all we need for our back piece. Pretty easy. Okay, so let's go take our back piece to the dress form and we'll drape the back. All right, guys, so here we go. Pretty similar to what we did in the back. We're going to start by just lining up our center back and our apex line. So again, I like my line to fall at the top of my twill tape. You can get it along the middle or below. We have enough fabric here that it doesn't really matter. You just want to keep this line parallel to the waistline. So let's go ahead and pin it. And then let's pin it all the way up to the nape, keeping that line really straight. Okay. All right. And we're just going to let that hang loose for a minute. So now we can see again, we don't have as much curvature to deal with. So this makes our life a lot easier in the back. Love it. But we still have a little bit of tension we need to release here. So let me grab my scissors and I'll be right back. Scissors. So we're going to go ahead and just cut, again, like you don't want to dip into the neckline or the nape line. So we're going to cut about a 1-inch square. And then we're just going to do some notching in a few places. Kind of come in at an angle. Don't want to come in too far. Same as the front. So if that didn't work out for you so well in the front, this is good second practice. Okay, and you can see just those few notches took out all that tension and allowed me to slide my fabric so that it's laying totally flat over my shoulder seam. Okay? And I can see that my apex line got released a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and I think I forgot to tell you guys to pin this in, so that was my fault, but let's go ahead and pin our apex in a couple spots along the shoulder apex. If you've pinned this and you're like getting some areas that aren't as flat, you can just come back in. Should be able to work it. Again, we do not want this to be so tight through here that there's no movement through the arms. So you can see this little, if I was to do this all the way over, you've got just this little bit right here. But when I slash into this, it's going to release that, and it's not going to leave like a huge gape there. We're talking probably 1/8 of an inch. And that's exactly what you want for easement, right around 1/8 of an inch. When you start getting past 1/8 of an inch, that's when you start to get a little bit of a wobble in your shoulder line. So you want it to be mostly flat with just a little pinch. Okay, so now we're going to come back in. Go ahead and pin all the way down your center back to right below your waistline twill tape. The more pins you do, you can do them in opposite directions. You know, if you are manipulating, oh, the door's gonna slam. It's windy here today. If you are manipulating a pattern that has a lot of darts or a lot of design lines and you're working off the center back, the more you stabilize the back, the more control you're gonna have to kind of really get in here and move this around and shape it or whatever you decide to do without your back slipping off the center back line. So, you know, for our purposes today, we don't need to go pin bonanza, but I like a stable line. Okay, so again, now we're gonna come back over. We're gonna go along our arm plate to, again, just right below it. Now, one thing that I didn't really state on the other side, on the front side, was that how you go about measuring where your arm size, so the line and hole around your shoulder is called an arm side. So where that ends is different. Like if you were making a pattern block for a jacket, your arm opening is going to be typically like an inch lower because, and sometimes even more depending on the style, because you have to think about the fact that there's going to be clothes underneath. So you're going to want more width there, so more room for the arm to move. With a dress or a t-shirt, which is basically what we're sloping for, is like a basic sheath block. You want it, right below that arm hole. You don't want to dip up into it because, again, you want your arm to move, but you don't want it gaping below because you don't want, a bra line to show, or you don't want it to like bleed into, the torso area, unless you're purposefully designing for that. So, but as a standard rule, when you're just making a block, that's not what we want to do. Okay, so now we're going to come in and we are going to clip up and release our tension. So again, we're coming up, we're just going to do our fringe right below the waistline, not into it. Okay. Now, if you wanted to drape out all your darts and have 0, it's pretty easy to do on the back. Again, some backs are easier than others, but you can see like we're still gonna have a little bit of gaping there. So what I like to do is we've got our grain line. We're just gonna kind of come through off this shoulder seam and we're just gonna smooth it out along the side seam. So don't pull fabric over, just kind of see how it's just hanging from where we pinned in on our side seam right underneath our arm side. Just take your hand and kind of smooth that down and pin it right below the waistline. Okay. And then you can go ahead and pin right outside your seam line because we're going to go on the opposite side of the seam line again. So both draping the front and the back, we're taking the seam line and we're bleeding into the opposite side. So I pinned towards the front of my form. When we did the front, we pinned on the opposite side of the seam towards the back. Okay, so now we've got this fabric here. And I'm gonna go ahead and I don't like that I've got a little bit of tension here, so I'm gonna cut up further. It's easier for me to see now that I've got plenty of room below my twill tape. And I can still get a little bit further up into there with leaving myself enough room to measure. But the more we cut, the more we release the tension through the body and the better understanding we get of what our dart is doing. So if you were to leave this unclipped to like here, again, you're gonna have some puckering through here. Then you go to build your dart and you're pulling it really tight and you might get some pulling through here, or you might be feeling frustrated because you can't get this to lie flat. It has nothing to do with, well, if you didn't block your piece correctly and it was off grain, it'd have to be pretty severely off grain, but it happens. That could be a potential problem. But typically, it's usually releasing the tension at the bottom of the fabric. So if you're finding yourself really frustrated, and you can do it through here too, through the arm, we don't want to go past, we don't want to go into the arm plate shoulder seam, but you can do it up here. If you're finding that you're getting gaps and ripples, depending on what kind of fabric you're working with, first thing to do is to look at if you've clipped your surface tension. It's kind of like when you're sewing, and you keep getting your tension like wadded up or your sewing machine's not working. Very, very first thing you do before you adjust anything else is you rethread your machine. If that doesn't work, then you make sure your needle is sharp. If that doesn't work, you rethread your bobbin. You make sure your bobbin is threaded correctly. So there's some steps you can do that once you get going, you'll start to recognize they'll just become so second nature that you won't even really have to think about it. But troubleshooting is a really, really big part of any kind of clothing design and sewing construction. And you kind of got to know what to look for and where to start to attack that, because it can sometimes add up into many minutes or hours of trying to problem solve something, whereas maybe you skipped a step and you realize, oh, I just spent an hour problem solving that when I could have just released the tension. So, okay, so now you can see we have got this fabric that we're dealing with here, and we want the back waist dart to kind of fall from the middle of the apex. So again, like we could have marked the middle of this and drawn our line down, which would give you an absolute. The reason why I didn't do that is because I kind of wanted you guys to intuitively feel it out and just use your eye to see that, okay, the middle of my dart should be falling, the base middle of my dart should be parallel to my center back. So my line should go up parallel to the center back. It's not going to be parallel to your side seam because your side seam isn't straight, right? So what I like to do is I like to come in and I've eyeballed, okay, like the middle line of the apex, I pinned it there, and I'm just going to kind of pull my dart in, and it's just that easy. There's your dart. It's not, this one is not crazy technical. So I'm going to put a pin. Again, you can see the excess fabric here, the little wing or flap that I have right here. And I'm going to pin bottom of the waistline on either side. Now, you want to make sure you're not pulling on it so hard that you're, you can put another pin in here, that you're pulling from your side seam. So just be really gentle. We want to get that excess fabric, but we don't want to pull it so tight that our side seam's coming loose, and then we've got a sloper that's too tight and doesn't fit our sloper block. So one pin on either side. Okay, and then I'm just going to make a crease as I go. Rule of thumb with the shoulder dart. So again, it depends on the type of body, but usually the shoulder dart's going to be anywhere from 2 inches, 2.5 to 3 inches below the apex of your shoulder. So, if you, again, it all depends on the form and body you're working with. So, and then, like I said before, we don't want to take this up so high that we're moving fabric in here. We want to leave a little bit of ease. So make sure the top of your dart, when you're at the very top of it, it's not like Okay, I'm doing it till I can't pinch anymore. I'm doing it till I can pinch to up about 1/8 of an inch. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use my fingers and put my pin in right at the top there. And then I'm going to mark it again. So I'm going to mark it on either side of the dart. Now don't mark on the side of the pin because it's going to make your dart too big. So mark right to the inside of your pin. And then I'm going to mark the very top, right in the middle, a little X of where my pin was. Okay, and then I'm just going to go ahead and do a couple little markers on the side. And just get this as creased as you can, because that's going to be our guideline when we go back. Because we didn't draw one in, we're going to use the crease as our guideline for the center of our dart. Okay, so next we're going to come along and we're going to mark below our waistline twill tape all the way to the side seam. We're going to come up here and we're going to mark along our neckline to the shoulder seam, and then we're going to mark along, just go ahead and feel it out, mark along the shoulder seam. Okay. And then let's do the same thing we did along our arm side shoulder plate. We're going to mark right alongside it. Now, when we go to transfer, we might take this line in like about 1/4 of an inch. If you marked it right to the silver plate, which the reason why I do that on both is because it actually gives you a nice line. But when I go to transfer it, I'm going to take it in about 1/4 of an inch because, you know, our shoulder seam doesn't come right up to our shoulder. It's usually back a little bit and it doesn't fall past it, because then you can't lift up your shoulder. So if you were to draw your block right up to that shoulder plate, or the armhole plate, you know, you're going to be right on the edge. So we're going to end up taking it back a little bit, but for now, go ahead and mark it, and then mark along the outside of your side seam. Okay, and just like right along the outside of your side seam. All right, and that's our center back. So we can go ahead and trim the excess to about 1 inch, 1/2 inch below. Make sure I got this. I want to come back in. I actually went a little too far out on my side seam here. So just double check. This is really important. Double check that all of your marks are there. Because once you get it cut and you take it off the form, if you didn't mark it properly, you have nothing to go by. And then, you know, you got to go back and put it back on the form, and, you know, you're not going to have to redrape all the way from the start, but you're definitely going to have to do some steps over. So, okay, so I've got this trimmed up, and as you can see, I went a little too far out here, so I'm just going to mark that out so I know that my inside line is the line, I want to go off of. All right, now we are going to bring our 2 pattern pieces together, true them up in accordance of one another, and then we're going to trace them to paper so we can have our permanent block. All right, so we've got our 2 pattern pieces here, the front and the back. And now what we're going to do is we're going to true up our lines. So there's a couple of tools that I really like. These are French curves. They come in a variety of different sizes, but they're tailoring tools that are made so you don't have to guess on your armhole. It kind of measures it for you. Same with the neckline, just gives you a nice curve. Snake rulers also work really well. These guys, you can bend curves into them to true up a line. So what is it does is it kind of eliminates the wobbliness of your hand. Now, if you're in a bind or you don't have any on hand, you can also use like a old coffee bin or something that's got a curve, and you can kind of adjust it around the form. So if your line that you drew off your dress form is, pretty, you feel like you got it pretty close to along that ridge, that arm ridge, then you can kind of eyeball it. But one thing I like to do is I like to draw in my lines and then pin it all together or base stitch it, bring it back to the dress form, and just make sure that everything, I treat everything correctly before I finally trace it. So, but what we're gonna do first is our darts. So let's go ahead and start with our center front. Grab your center front piece and then grab a ruler. Okay, so we have the top of our dart marked. And I like to use a Sharpie for this part. You could get a piece of paper and put it underneath your muslin if you're working on a surface where it might bleed through, because the muslin is really, it's really thin, and this will bleed through. So I oftentimes just grab a piece of paper and I will just put it underneath where I'm tracing, get it really flat. I even like to grab some pieces, like I can grab my scissors and use it as a weight. So weight the fabric around where you're working on it. If you have another ruler, you can use that. Just so stuff, and they make actual fabric weights, but I just use what's around. Okay, oops, scissors up there. Use this guy. So we've got our waist dart on the center front. Let's go ahead and start with that. We've got our line down the middle of the dart, which was our apex line. That is going to be the line that we build our dart off of. So what we want to do is we want to come into the bottom, and we're going to take our ruler and put it on either side, and we're going to measure how many inches it is from the center to our mark. So for me on the right, it's 1.5. I'm just going to mark 1.5. And then on the left, it's like just beyond 1.5. It's not quite at 5/8. But what I want to do is I want to take the smallest measurement of the two. So the reason why I take the smallest measurement on either side of the two is that way it allows you a little bit of wiggle room, and it's not going to make a big difference in the fit or ease of it if you say you take 1/8 of an inch off of one side, but if you were to take the largest measurement, then you're actually going to be digging into the bodice fabric, and that could potentially make your piece too small. So I'm going to mark 1.5 on this side, and then I'm going to even out my line and mark 1.5 over here, and it's just literally right on the inside of the line I marked. Okay, and then from here, it's super straightforward. You go up to the dot on the top of your dart, and you're going to draw a line down to your new measurement, and you're just going to connect them on either side. And you want to make sure, one thing you definitely want to make sure of is that this line is the same length. So I've got my line and it's 5 1/4. So I want to make sure that the line over here is also 5 1/4. So I'm actually going to start at 5 1/4 from that same dot down to my mark. Okay. And now one thing you can do to just check is just take your ruler, find your center line, and just kind of check it in a few spots. So, okay, that's equidistant at the bottom. I'm going to go up to the middle and line up this line. Yep, that's equidistant. And then at the very top, I'm going to bring this in just a bit. Okay, so I've got equal measurements from my center line to each side of the dart all the way down. Okay? Now we're going to go ahead and do that on our bust dart too. So we are going to take our ruler, and this is our center line here. And on either side, let's see, it looks like one side I have got 5/8. Yeah, 5/8. And then on the other side, I actually have closer to 7/8. So I'm going to go with my 5/8 inch mark, the smaller mark. So I'm going to measure, I've got my 5/8 inch right here on this side. So up, I'm going to measure 5/8 on the other side. So go ahead and get your measurements on each side equal. Okay. And then I've got my end mark that falls right on the apex. So let's see, it looks like it is from the very tip to the end. Okay, that's 3 5/8. I'm going to draw my line. And I want to make sure I'm at 3 5/8 on the other side. Going like same point on the line, 3 5/8. Perfect. Okay. And doing it in Sharpie ensures that, like any other pencil lines you had there, you know now that this is your new dart line. So you can see I've got my new darts marked. They're equidistant on either side. I've got the end point. Now, what we want to do is we want to go in and deal with our armhole. So I'm going to use my French curve, which is this guy. If you don't have it, go ahead and grab, if you're at home, you can grab a coffee tin or a bowl. There are some regulations or some standard measurements for armholes. I believe that the armhole measurement on a size 6, which is most likely the size dress model you're working with, is 5 1/2 inches. So you can go ahead and measure your depth from here up to your shoulder mark, and it should be around 5 1/2 inches. If it's a lot lower, like you measured way below your ridge, or if it's a lot higher, you can true up your line. Hopefully you have enough fabric here to do it, but you should have left enough fabric to true up your line. If not, what you can do is you can write a little note in here that says like add 1 inch or add 1/2 inch, and you can actually true that up when you go to do it on paper. But I'm really hoping that most of you guys measured right along your arm ridge, and you don't have to do that because that's kind of a one-on-one problem shooting. But I'm going to go ahead and you can see, so I feel like I measured in a little too narrow on my arm side. And that's because my dress form doesn't actually have the arm ridge, which is why these French curves are really helpful because they're standards. So, you know, if I was to use this as my final piece, it might be cutting in too far into the form. So I'm going to go ahead and use my French curve and redraw my new armhole. And I'm not going to do, I'm just going to do a straight line, so I know that's my new line. And, you know, again, like we're eyeballing this and we're going with what looks good and, you know, what we trust for fit. So if I go ahead and do this curve and then put it back on the form and it's not looking right, well, we can just redraw this line again. But always err on the side of caution. So rather than marking your line way far in what you had, just go ahead and use your curve. And if it pops out a little bit, that's okay. We can readjust once we're on the form. Okay, and then for across the shoulder, you just want to use your straight edge and connect those lines. We know this is going to be very straight. So for instance, I can see that mine popped out a bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull this line up a little bit and the neckline too. And I'm going to go from the highest point on that line. And I'm going to connect the two to get a straight edge. Keep in mind, again, this is our line without seam allowance. So all of these lines that we're drawing should fall directly on the seam line or guidelines on your dress form. Okay, and then the neckline, I'm going to go ahead and use my French curve again. I'm just going to find the curve that matches my line the closest. So sometimes you can just move that around. That's pretty spot on right there. Move it up a little. Okay. Great. And so for the side seam. Okay, so we have got our dart here. So let's go ahead and just fold the dart as if we were going to sew it. So fold on your apex and bring your two lines together and kind of look through the back. And then we are going to fold the dart up. So when we fold the dart up, what that does, if you folded it down and you cut it, it's actually going to slice into the dart. But if you fold it up, there's excess fabric, so it's going to give you like a little point at the end there, which is a guideline. And when you fold it up, you should see the line that you drew for your side seams should match. So let's go ahead and fold our dart so our side seams match. And then my side seam has a little bit of a curve right in the center. So I'm going to go ahead and flatten this. And I'm going to take my snake ruler and I'm going to follow this line. And I'm just going to try to get it as straight again as possible. So, followed my curve just a little. And then at the top and the bottom, I trued up my line. Okay. So, and then let's go ahead and trim that. So we're going to trim it now so we can get our dart in place. So just go ahead and trim. I'm going to just trim like a 1/4 inch outside of it because we are going to put this back on the dress form and just before we finally trace it. Okay, so you can see it's very subtle. but see how a bit of my, and it's because this is a small dart, but you can see how it kind of pops out instead of goes in. Okay, now same goes for the waist dart. We're gonna grab it in the middle, pull it together as if we were sewing it, so match up those side lines. Fold it. This is where if you drew in your fold line here, this is where you can use your fold line, so you're not over folding it. Okay. All right, now we want to true up the waistline. So again, I'm just going to kind of freehand this. There's a little bit of a curve. So your waistline is never going to be straight across on a sloper block. It's going to have a little bit of a curve because the body curves. But what you want to make sure of is that when you're tracing it, these ends, the end of your dart lines up exactly. You don't want one side to be longer than the other. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to mark this line underneath the dart several times. I like to make it quite dark. So when I go to fold back over, I can actually see it through the dart. And to get the pointed dart on your waist dart, you want to fold it towards the center front. So fold it towards the center front, and then I like to just bring those lines so you can true that line. You can even just use a snake ruler, and you want this front line to just not curve up too much. Okay, and then I'm gonna go and trim about 1/4 of an inch. Okay, you pull it out, and now you can see this is a little bit more dramatic, how the dart comes down. So if you were to have folded your dart this way and cut it, it would bump up into it. And the reason why having your dart down like this is really nice because it becomes a matching point when you go to have your final construction. So when we trace it, it's like a notch in a pattern, basically. Okay, so we've got our front trued up. I'm gonna trim off some of my neck excess here to make it look nice. Now, we want to true the back of our sloper to the front. So a couple of things about that. We want to, get our dart straight and make sure it's even on either side of the center line of the dart. But then we also want to make sure that we measured our side seams correctly, so our side seams match up from front to back. And then we also need to ensure that we marked our shoulder lines correctly. You can see right now, this is not matching up. The back line I drew further out. So we're gonna get those matched up right now. So that way when you go to put your piece together, it actually fits together. All right, but first thing is, why don't we go ahead and you can take a pin. If you're close to your sewing machine, I actually like base stitching my bust dart, and it doesn't take very long, and it's more accurate than pinning it. And that way we can really see, we can then really line these up and see, okay, our side seams are either too high, they're too low, but we need to make them match. And actually, this is pretty much dead on right now. And it should be, if you marked, if you were consistent about marking below or above your twill tape, they should match up. If they're off by a little bit, we can adjust that. But so go ahead and either base stitch in your bust dart or pin it, and then we'll meet back here. Also, I'm not sure if I said it or not, but a base stitch is just your longest stitch length. So on my machine, that's setting 5. And that's just so it's kind of like a stabilizer stitch. It's super easy to pull out. So now that you've got your dart stitched in, I really, really want to reiterate too, it's very, very important that you stitched this dart correctly and that you didn't stitch over or under your mark lines. They need to have met exactly. If that proved to be really hard for you, if you're still, kind of learning how to sew, or you needed to pin it, whatever it is, you can just go ahead and pull that stitch out, and we can just go with the measurements. You can just measure above the dart and below the dart what the side seam is. So basically, just take out the dart selvage through measuring. So this is just one technique. I like it for speed's sake, but when you're first learning how to do this, precision is really important too. And for some of you, that might be using a ruler, might be easier and more precise. For some of you, you might be top-notch sewers and feel like you can get your darts really tight and then put your piece together. But there's just a couple of different ways to do it. Okay, so first thing, let's go ahead, let's put our center front to the side for a minute, and let's true up our back waist dart. So we've got our apex here, and then below the apex we marked the top point of our waist dart. So if you have a regular ruler, go ahead and square the ruler off along the apex so the top of your ruler is exactly square and falls along that line until you hit your dot, and then you want to make sure it's straight all the way down, which is why I really love these guys, because I can see through them and I can see, okay, I'm going to move it just right into my line, and then I can see that it measures up on my grid all the way down. So go ahead and draw a straight line from the top of your dart down. Okay. Now, I can see right now that when I eyeballed it, there is actually a fair amount of difference between where I marked each side of the dart. So I'm going to split the difference on this one. I'm going to measure that whole width between the spaces. Oops. And it is 1 1/4. So got to do some math here. We need 1/2 inch plus 1/8 inch. That's 5/8 inch on either side. Now, the reason why I'm not just going with the smallest measurement on this one is because I have over 1/8 of an inch difference in how I marked this. And it's probably happening because I did not mark my guideline off of my center line to start. And it is just one really nice aspect about putting in those guidelines to start is that you know you're working square. And so when you use it as opposed to eyeballing it, sometimes your darts can come out a lot more even quickly. But I wanted to show you both ways. You can true it up after the fact and it's going to come out just as tight. So I'm going to disregard the marks that I put before. I know the total length of my width between the two. I cut it in half, and now I'm going to equidistantly mark 5/8 inch on either side of my dart line. Okay, so now if I go to measure that again, it should be the same width as the original measurement we had, the original distance between. It's just that we re-centered that original measurement over our new square line. And then we're going to do the same thing we did before, which is go from the very top of our dart down, making sure that the top of our ruler hits that dart dead on. Okay, and on mine it is, let's see, 5 7/8 to, excuse me, actually, I missed that mark. It's 6 1/8 down. So now I'm going to go on the other side, again, working from that top part of the dart down to my waistline, and so I hit my new mark, and make sure you've kept track of which mark is which. And I'm going to go again 6 1/8. Okay. Oops. And then what you can do again is take your ruler, measure all the way up, and make sure that you've got consistent, even marks all the way to the very top of the dart. And when you're first starting, it's definitely what you want to do. It's important that your darts are equidistant on each side. So, I go ahead and I'm going to bring in my Sharpie. I've got my new measurements marked. I'm just going to draw in, and then I'm going to go up and just make sure. Okay, that's good. I'm going to measure it in like 4 different spots. Yep, that's good. Okay, and then up at the top. That's looking good. Okay, so I've got it equidistant from the top to the bottom. If you need to adjust that, go ahead and take some time right now. But it's really important that you've got the same width on either side. So symmetrical, off your center line the whole way up. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and do our crease trick along the center line. Okay, get that creased, and then we want to bring our dart together. So one thing I like to do too is come in and actually crease the side. Oops. We're actually going to be folding our dart towards the center back, so I need to flip this around. So come to your dart side that is closest to your side seam and actually crease along that. Right along that line, making sure that the line stays in the middle, so kind of a precise. And then you're going to bring that line and match it to the other side of your dart, all the way up till the top. Okay. And then your waistline, we're going to true that up. So go ahead, and you can see I need to just get my line so that it's coming across. And I'm going to use a snake ruler again. If you don't have a snake ruler, that's okay. You can eyeball it. So if you want to eyeball it, I'm going to. So you can see there's like maybe an 1/8 inch of a gap here. Right where, this is where my waistline ended and where I started drawing the new line. So I'm just going to bring that down and connect those over. Now if you have a snake ruler, you can just use that to kind of clean up any wobbly lines you see. can do the same thing with your previous start where you can stitch it in, but you certainly don't have to. On this one, because we don't really need to for right now. It's good to kind of bring it over to the dress form again, but I just like to pin it. Grab a pin. But because we're not measuring it against another line, we can just kind of pin it. Actually, I'm going to pin it across. So I just want to keep it measured up correctly. I'm going to pin it across and through that center. Okay, and then I'm going to trim across there. So I'm going to trim across the bottom, still leaving about 1/4 inch, but just trimming the excess so it's about the same. Take this out. Okay, and now you can see we've got our dart with the point in it again. The wider the dart, the more extreme the dart, the pointier the tip will be. But the rule of thumb is to always fold towards the center front and towards the neckline, and that's going to give you your points. Okay, so now what we want to do, let's go ahead and we want to true the back to the front. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to start with the shoulder seam, and I, again, just crease it. I've got the center front here, so I've got my front panel, and I'm creasing it along the shoulder line. And then I'm going to bring up my back panel, and I'm going to match up my neckline. So got my neckline here, and I can see that I've got quite a bit extra. Looks like about maybe a little over 1/4 inch. And you have to make sure that your neckline is matching up correctly. So actually, let's go ahead and before we do that, let's get our curve in, because this is going to affect too. Our curve in for our neckline. So use your French curve, your snake ruler, or coffee can, or anything that's curved. If you're using a curve that doesn't go all the way across, you know, say like that was your original neckline right there, and you're like, all I have is some duct tape. So you're like, okay, I'm gonna just do it in small sections and slowly get that curve to connect. And then you would come back in and kind of true it up by hand again. So there's little hacks you can do to get circles to work. Obviously, the longer and more consistent the edge you have, the better off. And, you know, if this is something you're really interested, like you want to pursue clothing making, definitely invest in some of these. You can get like 3 of them for, you know, $15. So they're not too bad, and almost every fabric store has them. So, okay, I'm going to follow this line. And how did I choose where to put it? Well, I know I don't want to move it here because that's going to add a ton of width to my neckline. So I just picked a curve that already fell within the lines I had marked. So, okay. Now, your dress form should have the nape of your neck and your arm plate marked. So here's the question for you. If you are coming up with a little bit of an uneven shoulder line, like I am, do you feel like you marked your nape too close, too far in, or did you go past your arm plate? So the best way to go check that is to just go take both pieces back to the dress form, place them up there again, and just double check it. Say, okay, actually, this is great. This goes up to the arm plate. This is like the good side seam. Or no, okay, actually, I did mark both of the sides of my arms correctly, but I brought my nape in too high right here. Or maybe it's a little bit in between. So for me, I know, because I went and checked, I actually pushed out my shoulder seam too far when I did the back. So I don't have an arm plate on that model. So for me, it's a little less accurate. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up your necklines, and then I'm going to mark my new, so you can see that went quite a bit over. And that's why having really precise dress forms is important, but it's also why we true up our patterns. But just make sure that, when you're draping it, that, you're following those guidelines as close as you can. And if you don't have a dress form that has the guidelines, go back and pin these pieces, pin the front and the back together and drape it and see, okay, is the neckline too tight? Does the, shoulder line fall too far up? So again, like, trust your best judgment. Part of it is knowing clothes, part of it is experience. But I think it's good to kind of make mistakes like this, because what it does is it allows you to go back and problem solve on the dress form. There's not going to be any tried or true, like, do this to fix it, in theory. You have to go fix it on the form. And I really like that idea because, again, not all bodies are the same. So if you think about even when you buy a pattern from the store and you make it, well, it's not very often that you're just going to make that pattern, throw it on your body, and it's going to fit perfectly. A lot of times, you have to make little alterations, and that's why even sewing from a pattern can be so tedious and challenging and frustrating for first-time sewers, because you follow the directions to a T and then you put it on and it doesn't look right. So this just gives you kind of more control and confidence to say, okay, I am not letting a rule tell me what to do. I'm actually looking at the form, and I'm looking at the way the fabric falls, and I'm knowing, like, a shoulder seam needs to go to the edge of my shoulder. So it needs to go to where there's a bend in your shoulder. It shouldn't come over or too far away, especially with a sloper. Anyways, okay, so that was my do-it-yourself diatribe. Okay, so let's come in, and now that I've got my new shoulder mark, I'm going to come in and take my straight edge and true that up. So connect those lines. Okay. And now I've got my French curve, and I've got my new shoulder that I'm working off of, new shoulder line. Okay, and when you're doing this, again, make sure you stop where your side seam was before, that you're not, having your curve and then it's coming, like, cutting into your side seam again. You gotta keep the top of your side seam where it was. Okay, now we're gonna true up our side seam. So mine has a little bit of a curve. Okay. All right, now moment of truth. So let's go ahead and fold along that edge of the side seam, making sure our mark is right on the fold. Okay. Then we're going to come in. We're going to do the same thing on our center front. We're going to fold back the excess, which is not really seam allowance right now, but it's equivalent to it. Okay. And then we're going to do these. Now, the reason why I like to do this as well, because if you don't have a snake ruler, I just want to show you a few ways where you can do it by hand and by eyeballing it and still have accuracy. Because the thing is, you need these measurements to be exactly the same. If they aren't, even if they're like an eighth of an inch off, say you go to trace them and you eyeballed it, but you weren't super precise about it. Well, okay, so now you have a sloper block that's just a little bit off. If you were to start making a pattern off of that, you make your pattern, you cut it, you go to get it on the form, well, all of a sudden you have uneven areas and you have to go back and troubleshoot why that happened all over again. So it's really, really important that your shoulder seams are the exact same length. Your side seams are the exact same length. So just go back and double check with your ruler. You know, we've done this by eye and by hand, but then you're going to go back and you're going to make sure that this measurement across here is exactly the same as the measurement across here, and same with our side seams. So for me, if I'm just eyeballing it and I'm on my fold, yeah, those match up exactly, but that's eyeballing it. So let's go ahead. If you are not, measured up correctly, then there's a couple of things to check. One, if this is sewn, I want you to take that out, and we're just going to take out that measurement that was here with the ruler, and we'll measure above and below it, and then we'll line it up to this. And if it's off, you're going to take it back to the form, and you're going to see, okay, did I mark this too far below my twill tape? Do I need to move it up around here a little bit? So again, troubleshooting this it's really dependent on how you draped it. So I can't tell you unequivocally one way or another, okay, you did it wrong this way, because I'm not there with you. But if you hold it up to your dress form, I just want to teach you a few troubleshooting skills that you can do on your own to know, okay, I went too far below my twill tape or too far above, but what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and pull out my base stitch. Okay, so I just pulled on one thread and it came right out. Okay, and so now, very accurately, I'm going to measure from the top of my dart to where my underarm mark ends. Okay, that's 1 1/4. I'm going to write that down. And then below, I'm going to measure from the very bottom of my dart to the bottom of my side seam. And that is 5 3/8. So we'll do our math. 1 2/8, so 6 4/8, or excuse me, 6 5/8. So 6 5/8 is my total side seam measurement for my center front. So now, because this curves a little, this is where our snake ruler can come in super, super handy because we want to make sure that this side seam measurement is exactly 6 5/8. So what I can do with the snake ruler is that I can follow that curve exactly. Okay. And looks like, yep, 6 5/8. It's dead on. It's just right past the halfway mark, which is probably very, very hard for you guys to see. But if you are off on this measurement, what you need to do is go ahead and get this dart either pinned in or base stitched again. Take your pieces back to the dress form and you're going to pin them on just like you had. So pin the center front, pin the shoulder seams, line up the shoulder seams for the front and the back. Get your dart flat, get this guy all pinned on, and then you're gonna see, okay, where does my bottom line fall? Do they both fall below the twill tape? Does one fall above? You know, did I mess up my line, when I did my underarm? So you're just gonna make some adjustments. And if you line them up and pin them up at the shoulder seam and they match, then you want to see where they fall along the twill tape or the underarm. So again, it's a lot of go back to the form, see if it works. And you want to get everything trued up so it's spot on. And then it's a matter of tracing this to your permanent piece of paper. So let's go ahead and just take these back to the dress form and just see how they fit together. Okay, so I went ahead and I got my 2 slopers pinned back onto my dress form. So first thing I did is that I came up here and I folded down the excess selvage on my shoulder seams and I matched them up exactly on here. And you can see my measurement is the same, but if yours is a little bit off, this is where we can start to kind of fix it. But I just went ahead and tucked under my excess, you can see right under there, and then just put the fold right on the seam line and pinned it down. And then from there, I pinned down my center back through here and my center front. I got my darts pinned down, and if you basted them ahead of time, that's great too. So on the front, I got my center front pinned down. I just pinned it 2 at the top and kind of 2 at the bottom. Remember, we took our 1/8 inch ease allowance here. So you're gonna have just a little bit of a gap there, but you wanna make sure that your line matches up again. And this is my dart sew line, so you can see my bust line stays along with my twill tape. So now I'm gonna start to look for what might need to be tweaked. So places we're making sure things are matching up, like I said, our shoulder seams, we're making sure those are even. We're coming down here and we're making sure that the bottom of our sloper falls along the bottom of our twill tape. And same on the back. And I can see right here, I think, excuse me, I need to adjust my back. It looks by about 1/8 of an inch. So I'm just gonna come in here and mark that. Just right along there. Just to kind of even that up. And the marks can get a little confusing. So what I like to do is I just cross them out, and then you want this guy. So it looks like my line came up a little long right underneath my dart. So I'm just gonna draw my new line just with some hatch marks. And what I did is that before I had gone through and marked with a Sharpie, I remarked with the pencil. So you now know, just make sure your lines are differentiated. So when you pull it back, you're not confused. Okay, so that's one area. Now I'm gonna go through here and I'm gonna see, okay, looks like my arm size match up pretty well. I wanna fold back my extra and just bring that line right up there and put a pin in it. Now, you don't want to just arbitrarily line up the arm side, because if you do, let's say, for instance, this was falling a lot lower and you're like, well, I'm gonna line it up. And then you have this gap, which is exactly what we were trying to drape out. So line it up so that it still falls flat on the body, and then you're gonna adjust your line from there. Because keep in mind, when we pulled this back to our drafting board off the form, we were using our either French curves or our coffee cups or whatever circular tool we had to kind of get our line in here. And what we're doing right now is we're just making sure that that this armhole is the right size, around 5.5 inches of our depth, about 3 inches across our width, but it just depends on your model. And again, to reiterate, this is really about you looking and seeing what works on the form, because when you drape, it's about adjusting to the form. So if your seams do not match up, go ahead and pin them, and then you're gonna remark the line. So what I would do is if one came substantially lower or higher, you can split the difference, or you can take the one that's lower. If you run into a circumstance where you made a big mistake and you went like way beyond the arm plate, or you didn't have an arm plate guideline, you can always cut a little piece of fabric and insert it in here. I actually like to go in and just kind of base stitch a little piece in here, and then you can kind of add in and make up for it. Or a piece of paper works too. So, if you have a place you need to correct, don't feel like you're gonna have to redrape the whole thing. There are methods you can use to either add fabric in or take it out. Okay, so, and I actually feel like I'm gonna fold this back this way so you can see. I think this is pretty close. So there's my seam lines, but I actually want to I want to add a bit more curve to my bottom part, because there's just a little bit of extra there, like maybe 1/8 of an inch, that meets up with my side seam. So I'm going to go in and I'm just going to come back on the fold and draw in my new line, which is it's just barely over. And you can see it's just barely in. But I'll go back and I'll true that up with a ruler and get it to really straight and clean line. So once you have it kind of all pinned together, again, I can also see right here that I measured my bottom just a little off my twill tape here. So I'm going to come in and I'm just going to true that up so that it matches the front. So we want 2 pieces that connect perfectly on the side seam and the shoulder seam. That's really, really important. And that they fall evenly across your waistline twill tape. Other things we're looking for is that we don't have like a bunch of waffling gaps through our arms. So that's going to have to do with the success of our bust drape and also the success of the curve we drew here. So these are just a few kind of trouble areas to look for. But in general, you can see this is fitting really well. There's some easement here. The dart ends about an inch below my bust line on either side. It's very flat and clean through here. It falls over the shoulder line. We're not creeping into the arm bracket here. This I might come back in and decide, okay, I want to bring this down a little bit more, but we don't have to worry about that for right now. The back also looks really clean. I've got my new waistline measurement in there. This is still falling across the apex. So it's looking really good. Now, you have your sloper draped. From here, if there was any like lines you needed to clean up, you're going to go through the second process of truing up. Sometimes I even like to grab a different color pen, like green or red or whatever, as my final mark. And I'll do that. I'll take it and put it over the places that I fixed. And then what you're going to do is you're going to cut off all the selvage. So you're going to cut along all of your final design lines. And there's a couple of things. You can transfer it to paper using carbon transfer, which you can get at most sewing stores, or you can flatten it out onto paper. And I like to use fabric weights like I talked about before. And if you get a Sharpie, a ballpoint Sharpie, you can press and hold through the muslin onto the paper. And it's another hack. Like clothing construction, all the materials you need to do it can add up, but there are hacks around it. So I just encourage you to figure out what those hacks are. But the whole point is that you need to make sure you're transferring this back onto the paper very precisely, because any measurements, any time you shift it, even a little bit, even an eighth of an inch, you're going to come back on here, put your sloper on, and you're going to be like, oh, I got to fix that again. But that being said, once you transfer this to paper, your next step is you're going to cut it out on the fold. So this is going to be your new fold line. And you're going to make the whole front and the whole back, sew it like you would with the darts. I usually leave an opening on one whole side, or you can leave an opening through the back, whichever's easiest. And then that is going to be your final drape. So when you do that, you're going to come in and you're going to use it as if it's a base pattern piece, but you're going to do your final check there. So while this might seem like this is your very final step to getting your sloper totally correct, the last step would be sew it in, it's a finished garment piece, put it on here, and then you're going to do a check just on one half of the body like we did again, and make sure it's fitting correctly. And then you can go back and adjust it again. Typically, if you get this really dialed in and you transfer it very precisely, when you go to do your final sloper in your full garment construction, it should be fine and it will look really good. And then you've got this baseline pattern piece that you can work off of again and again and again. And as you can see, this becomes really fun, because what if I were to let this dart out and I just had the bust dart, and say I let out my back dart, okay, you can start to see how an A-line could be made. You could, without even having to really drape the bottom, you could come in and use this as your side line and bust out your line on the diagonal and have a super fun draped shirt or dress where it's nice and fitted through the top, your armhole's correct, you've got everything's on grain. And I have to say, an A-line dress is, man, that's a golden piece of garment for anyone designing women's wear. You can build a lot off of an A-line dress. And this will just start to give you some ideas of where to build shape. You know, you can come in and you can start like building yokes through here or different necklines. And again, like you might have to deal with a little bit of easement through here, but you'll have your base piece. So it's not like you'll have to drape from scratch. You just take your sloper pattern and you start to build design lines off of it, probably much like what you've been doing with your sloper piece that was given to you at the beginning of the year. But now it kind of gives you an idea of how to come back on the form and apply everything. So yeah, I hope this was super helpful to you guys. Again, I'm sorry I can't be there today to answer questions, but certainly Annika can field questions and always email me. And yeah, I wish you the best for the rest of your semester. One quick note too before I go that I wanted to add. Keep in mind that this is a sloper without seam allowance. No seam allowance in it. So just remember that once you have it traced and transferred to paper and you're going to do your final garment construction, so build it in full for the whole body, you have to add your seam allowance back in. And I always cut in at least a half an inch of seam allowance when I go to do my final sloper. That way, if you have to make those adjustments, if you had some issues when you were transferring this or you're just finding some other places, you have plenty of fabric to work with. And you have to make sure, again, this is really important, that you're adding even seam allowance the whole way across. So either make yourself a little jig that's half an inch long and put it along every line and make sure that your seam allowance is all totally even. And then make sure when you're sewing it, you're sewing it exactly with half an inch seam allowance, which is twice your presser foot. Your sewing machine should have that half inch mark. So I guess all I'm trying to drive home here is that if you aren't precise with your craft, you're not going to know where the mistake was made. So it's really, really important that your measurements are correct, that your seam allowance is correct when you cut it, when you trace it, when you sew it, that you're sewing it on. The first time I ever did this, which was like a million years ago, probably 20 some years ago, I had my sloper, I had my measurements, and I measured in my half an inch seam allowance. But when I went to go sew up my garment construction, I forgot and I sewed it with a quarter of an inch. And so then when I went to put it on my dress form, it was huge. It was massive. And it was an all padded out dress form, so it was all very particular. And I started to redrape it until I realized, like, oh, I didn't sew it with the correct seam allowance. So just save yourself the trouble and be consistent, be sharp and precise with your measurements, and the playful parts, the fun parts of the design will all come in. But trust me, it's more fun when you don't have to go back and do something again and again.